I don't think I said this in my book, but I say it to people sometimes. We're already on the other side.
Sure.
Yes.
Who we really are is already on. We're just looking through these eyeballs, right? And so on some level, we know what's involved in communicating with the physical plane. We're doing it right now. And simply, however we do it, just becoming more aware of that process and that where we are coming from, that we're not coming from our bodies, we're coming from ourselves. And the more we can be in touch with that on an ongoing basis, the clearer picture we'll have of how to do afterlife communication. We're doing it right now in that sense.
Welcome to Soul Explorers with your hosts, Gary Langley and Sally Taylor. Welcome to Soul Explorers. We're your hosts, Sally Taylor. My name is Gary Langley, and today we have Daniel Drasin with us. Daniel's done two what I consider to be groundbreaking documentaries, Calling Earth and Scole, the Afterlife Experiment. He also has a book, A New Science of the Afterlife, Space, Time, and the Consciousness Code. Daniel, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you so much. And thank you, Sally.
Thank you. We're so glad you're here. And I was mentioning as we were chatting just a little bit before we started that your two documentary films are some of my absolute favorite topics, which are on ITC or instrumental transcommunication. And the other one is the kind of the history and evidence from the Scole group and the Scole Experiment, which was a physical mediumship circle in the UK. So I just if anybody is interested in those topics, I'm going to say right from the get-go to find your films. They are available to be seen. In fact, do you want to tell people where they can find those before I go on to a first question?
Sure. I'll mention them now. Maybe we can repeat them later. I created some abbreviated links for Calling Earth. It's very simple. It's bit.ly/Call Earth, one word, bit.ly/Call Earth. And for the Scole Experiment film, it's bit.ly/Scole Movie. That's easy to remember, bit.ly/Scole Movie. And that'll take you to the to Vimeo, where you'll see the highest quality reproduction of the films. And they're both feature-length documentaries. Calling Earth runs about 90 minutes, and the Scole Movie runs about 85, about the same length.
I just can't speak highly enough about them. They are really wonderfully done documentaries on these topics. And if anybody is at all interested in what hard evidence of the afterlife there is, these two films are really great for beginning to show some of that evidence. So let me ask you, Dan, what in your life drew you to these particular types of topics to the point that you would make films about them and write a book?
Well, I could go back to my fascination with back at the age of 7 with things like extraterrestrial life and all kinds of perspectives that kind of exceed the view of our present common worldview or civilization. And I'm sure I'm not alone in that. It's so interesting that so many of these things that are denied in our culture, there are a lot of people who are really interested and intrigued with them, and you wouldn't know it because we can't talk about it. And early on, I used to kind of stick my neck out and ask people if they've had any sort of strange experiences, and they would say, no, nothing like that ever happened. And then, oh, wait a minute, there was this thing that happened when I was 14 years old. And then it all sort of comes spilling out. Rupert Sheldrake, one of my favorite New Scientists talks about, all the constraints and taboos within the academic and scientific culture. He says, but you got to go to the pubs where they get together, the academics and the scientists get together after hours and listen to what they really talk about. So, a lot of what we take to be reality or proof or anything definitive tends to be defined sociologically very often more than technically or physically. And that's been a fascination of mine, because I think our collective worldview could stand some loosening up, you might say. And I think science is a very important element here. Because when science is playing by its own rules and really expressing its own spirit, science to me is basically organized curiosity. And at the point where science was just distinguishing itself, several hundred years ago, I think it had the right idea, questioning established authority of the church or whatever. And it represents, and interestingly, both science and democracy originated at about the same point historically. And, both are based in people having the freedom to inquire, to have their own opinions, to test things in real life, and to act from there, and never to arrive at any kind of concrete conclusions. Science is open-ended by definition, and anytime anyone purports to dictate absolute reality in the name of science, they've really fallen back into the religious framework. So science is dynamic. There's many variations on it depending on the discipline you're in, but the basic idea is, on the one hand, open-mindedness and curiosity, and the willingness to test your observations and your theories. And once you've tested something and find that it passes all of your tests, you still hold it provisionally. To me, that's what lets us be open-ended to all kinds of new discoveries and new perspectives on life and reality in general.
And you made new discoveries when you encountered Mark Macy in Colorado. Could you tell us a little bit about that and your skepticism at the time?
Well, I've been interested in far out stuff all my life. At this point, which was circa mid-1990s, I've been living out in Boulder, Colorado for a few years at that time, and met Mark Macy, who was has been one of the foremost researchers of instrumental transcommunication, communication with the other side through modern electronics. He had just written a book about it. He gave me a copy. I was actually kind of skeptical at the outset. I had sort of vaguely heard about this sort of thing, but wasn't really that familiar with it. But the more I looked into it, and the more I met people who had actually been practicing this, the less skeptical I became and the more curious. After I moved back to the San Francisco Bay Area around 1995, I started digging into this question more and more. And shortly after the year 2000, I met Tim Coleman, British-American filmmaker. We teamed up and traveled around the United States and to England, Scotland, Spain, doing actually two documentaries. One was exploring instrumental transcommunication specifically, and the other one was focused on the Scole Experiment. This was an experiment in physical mediumship that took place in a tiny English village of Scole. It's so tiny, you can walk through it in 30 seconds, practically. And in the middle of Scole is this 17th century farmhouse in which this experiment was conducted by two couples between about 1994 and 1999, thereabouts. And the experiment was in physical mediumship, which, as you know, is the practice of bringing through from the other side very strongly evidential, very often physical evidence. This can be in the form of apports, objects which appear out of nowhere and just precipitate in front of you, and are perfectly solid objects that are subject to any kind of analysis you want to perform on them. And also materializations of parts or whole human bodies occupied by the soul in question. And normally it takes a period of development for this sort of thing to take place. People who are considered physical mediums go through, some of them may have had some of this ability naturally, but there's a period of training and discipline and so on, depending on the individual, and also depending on the way in which they work. A lot of physical mediumship is conducted in what we consider a traditional way, which developed, as far as I know, mainly in the 19th century, which involved traditional form of seance, where the medium was wholly or partly obscured inside of a was called cabinet. And of course, this gave rise to accusations of fraud and so on, and that's understandable. There are physical mediums today who work in that genre, but they're also subject to things like infrared photography and so on, which demonstrate that these phenomena are really occurring, although the room may be in partial or total darkness. The Scole experiment was different in that it was conducted, while it was conducted in darkness, all participants were in the same room together with each other. The room, which was in the cellar of this farmhouse, was below ground. There was a fair amount of radio silence down there, which was held to be an advantage in this kind of experimenting. They were very conscious of avoiding any accusations of fraud. So everyone wore luminous wristbands that were fastened with Velcro, so you couldn't remove them without hearing it. Every movable object in the room had luminous tabs attached to it. So while the room was darkened, you could still see the positions of things in the room. So you couldn't get away with sleight of hand or moving things around artificially. Everyone sat around a table, which was constructed so that you couldn't stick your hands underneath it and manipulate things. So this was one aspect of the care that was taken in setting this whole experiment up. Also, once they began to get results, they invited guests, visitors. Many were scientists, engineers, folks who had considerable experience in researching these kinds of things. 3 of them actually were members of the British Society for Psychical Research, who'd had years and years of experience, and they knew all the magic tricks that could be pulled to make these things seem to be happening. And after joining just about every session for 2 years, they declared that this was clean. They found no evidence of trickery or fakery. They had also hundreds of visitors over the 5-year period from all walks of life. Ordinary folks, people who'd had some of these experiences themselves, many who hadn't, and also quite a number of scientists and engineers who were curious enough and willing to stick their necks out by even being there, and who were happy to attest to the fact that they could find no conventional magic tricks being pulled. They also, once they felt ready to do this, they traveled. They were actually invited to do sessions in several European countries, as well as the United States. There's a medium in Los Angeles who invited them to hold sessions in his house, Brian Hurst. And 10 years after those sessions, I went down to Los Angeles and interviewed people who'd attended the sessions, and they were as jazzed 10 years later as they had been at the actual event, and gave us very, very detailed descriptions of their experiences. So this was the real deal. And we were privileged to meet these people, to be in the Scole hole, they call it, the cellar, and actually be with the folks who did it. They subsequent to that, they dispersed. Robin and Sandra Foy went off and retired in Spain. They're both now on the other side. So we were quite privileged to spend this time with them. We traveled around. We shot a huge amount of footage, and then we basically made two films. One focusing on Scole, the other on instrumental transcommunication in general. We attended a big conference in Spain, in the city of Vigo, that was devoted to ITC. It was sponsored by a local bank, and the local mayor gave the keynote address. So it was a very, very solid and professionally done kind of thing. Anyway, Tim and I took the footage home, and out of this we made these two films. They're actually three films. Tim and I, at a certain point, went our separate ways. I finished Calling Earth. Tim did his own version of the Scole film, which he called The Afterlife Investigations, which included other material. Before we separated, though, we had done our own edit of the Scole film, which we now call the director's cut, and focus exclusively on Scole. And that is Scole, the Afterlife Experiment, which you've seen. So that's probably a longer story than you wanted, but that's the history.
No, that's okay. I'm curious, as you began to investigate these things and you came in with your healthy skepticism, open-minded skepticism, was there ever a point where you realized there was no going back from sort of what it opened you up to? Was there a single instance where you said, oh my goodness, this is real? Or was it just sort of all cumulative, I guess?
I guess that's really more how it was. I mean, we wouldn't have embarked on this in the first place if we already hadn't, given it a certain amount of credence. And my skepticism was never what I call pseudo skepticism, which is outright disbelief.
Cynicism, yeah.
More a curiosity on my part to distinguish, because there's a certain amount of wishful thinking in all of these areas. So I just wanted to make sure that what we were looking at, what we were documenting, was clean, and that it could stand up to in any kind of scrutiny. And I think we both felt satisfied in that.
I think it's important to go in with a certain amount of open-minded skepticism. I mean, I got to experience David Thompson's physical mediumship last year. In fact, a year ago this month, and I was in two sittings, and several things occurred to me. I got to be a checker, for one, where I checked the room, checked David, which was really important to me. And figuring up the amount of money made, what it costs to bring him and part of his circle here to participate. There are a lot easier hustles out there than trying to fake any of this stuff. And I was, dazzled, still am dazzled by what I experienced in that physical mediumship circle. It was just a really profound experience. It's still bringing things up within me that I didn't realize were there. I'm still digesting the experience in many ways. It was mind-boggling, mind-opening, and affirming of what I knew about the afterlife. I didn't go into it too strong of a skeptic because I've had out-of-body experiences which have convinced me that, there's way, and they were evidential. So there's a whole lot more going on here than, we generally accept. What brought you to the point to jump from filmmaking to writing the book, A New Science of the Afterlife?
I don't remember. I think folks have encouraged me to write a book, and so I did. It was an interesting process for me because I tend to be very impatient, and writing is a grind to really do it right. So that's basically the story. That I was encouraged to do so, and because I had a certain point of view and certain ideas that I wanted to get across, and seemed like like an interesting area to get into, so I did. And a very dear friend of mine, Richard Grossinger, who's a writer and former publisher himself, is now working with my publisher, Inner Traditions. And so he was kind enough to get my book in the door, and I got some nice endorsements for it. And so people seem to like it. And I've gotten some really interesting communication, people writing me through my website, having uh, you know their own experiences validated, or having questions and so on. And for the most part, these have been people who are professionals, interesting and well-educated folks who've had these experiences, and want to connect with someone who can be on their wavelength.
That leads to my next question. And my next question is, from the time you started doing these films and ultimately writing a book, do you feel that the consciousness of the planet has changed from then to today? Do you feel there's more openness to this subject? And I think I'm ultimately leading into the idea that there's a consciousness shift happening on the planet. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that in general terms, it's fair to say that the extent to which it's an actual shift and the extent to which we're simply acknowledging something that's always been there, I don't know. I can't make that judgment. But I think that probably the biggest shift that's gotten us here, even to ask this question, is podcasting, which has broken mass communications free of all the social and political and economic constraints that kept us in an ideological and spiritual box. Actually, certainly book publishing has been free of that for years. I'll grant that, but in terms of a popular medium, the fact that we can now be anywhere on the planet at once at the same time. Zoom and similar technologies have helped a lot as well, and have been a good platform for podcasting. So I'm bringing this up because it's been said the medium is the message, and we can put double or triple or meanings on that. But so many things have loosened up, and our world is very chaotic and in some ways threatening right now. And at the same time, so much has broken free in terms of even in mainstream physics. My model for science, well done science, is really the area of astronomy, because there's so much new evidence being gathered by the new technologies we have, new telescopes and so forth, that it can't be denied. And while the interpretations may vary, the fact that so many old convictions are being overturned now about the nature of just a physical reality, that that astronomy cannot stand still. And so it's my favorite model for science being practiced as it should be. And it's also a model for how our inquiries into our inner nature should be, and is now becoming more and more the norm. Could you ask your question once more? Because I think I've gotten a little bit off the track.
From the time you started doing your films to present day, do you feel like the acceptance level, the awareness of people has expanded enough to really incorporate this as, what if all of this is the way it is?
Right.
And we here kind of know that it is, but not everybody knows that it is. So,
well, we know how it is now, but even we don't know what the ultimate trajectory is going to be. We have a certain image of expanded consciousness, of a new awareness, but we too, who may be in some sense at the leading edge of this, we and our friends and colleagues, we have a sense of where it's going. But my sense is that there are some discoveries yet to be made, and also changes in our language about it as a result. My simple answer is yes,
Yes.
and I think that even our conceptions about it are works in progress.
Oh, absolutely. And as a good friend of ours always says, there will always be the mystery. There's an essential element of mystery to any of this because there's no ending point. We're opening, developing, hopefully becoming better people in this earth experience, which influences our afterlife experience. Would you say that's true?
I would say that's true. I think it's all of a piece.
Sure.
We demarcate the life and the afterlife in a very obvious way, physical death of the physical vehicle. But there are other demarcations, departments, areas, reality bubbles. All we need to do is acknowledge that the boundaries we're aware of that separate one adventure from another adventure, you might say, that's only part of the picture.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're right. Afterlife is a misnomer because spirit will tell you there is no afterlife. There's only life.
And also, and as I say in my book, calling it the afterlife kind of precludes the before life. We don't want to preclude anything at this point. And also, it kind of trivializes the afterlife. Like, this is our real life here in the physical, and the afterlife is like this tail you pin on the donkey. It's this little appendage, that may or may not be real. I think the more we think of it, of our existence as a continuum with demarcations, not boundaries, but just demarcations.
Sure.
We have, whether time is real in some ultimate sense or not, we do have an awareness of the passage of events.
Yep.
And and it goes in one, we think it goes in one particular direction. And whether that's absolute or it's just a useful convenience, I don't know. But whatever, we all have this sense of events transpiring one after the other. And there are theories about whether time is simultaneous or it can go in any direction and so on. I'm not sure we need to get too hung up on that. Probably coming back down to earth and focusing on how we treat each other is a much more important.
I agree with you wholeheartedly on that. I often get discouraged. People are so invested in finding out about their past lives. And I think much of that is misunderstood, the mechanics of it, so to speak. It's not that you can get lost in the weeds. And I think it's so important to be focused on the here and now, and what we're doing now has such an impact.
Right. And if now is eternal, then it becomes really important to be here in the now.
Exactly. Sally, I can see you have a question brewing.
I do. I just didn't want to stop anybody from their flow. But let me take us back just a little bit to some of the evidence. Since again, we've got the movie Calling Earth, which deals with ITC, and it's been 10, 15 years since that movie first came out. How long ago? What was the date on that?
We release various versions of the edits and so on, but I would say that the mid 2000s, the time frame represented in the film is the early mid 2000s.
Okay. So my question is then, with the way that technology has been, growing by leaps and bounds, basically exponentially, have you kept abreast of how perhaps communication coming through technology has continued to evolve as well? Is it an area that you have retained any focus in?
To the extent that I followed it, for example, in the work of Gary Schwartz, who wants to produce a soul phone, and I'm also started working with a couple of guys in the UK, one of whom is developing some new devices to hopefully respond to energies from the other side. It's a question mark for me. The simple technologies that we had, 20, 30 years ago worked fine for ITC. Tape recorders, cassette recorders, and so on, early digital recorders. The focus, in my opinion, should be on our attitudes and our connections with those on the other side. That individually and collectively, the more people who do this, the more effective I'm sure it will be, regardless of the technology. Technology to me is secondary. If we know that XYZ technology has worked for some people, fine, let's stick with that and make that work as well as we can. Getting hung up on the technology, I mean, I'm not against progress, and I'm not against discovering what might be more sensitive to information from the other side. But we already know what works, and I think it's important to first develop what we know works, and then possibly work with new technology. There was a period of time back in the 1990s when there was an international group, which Mark Macy was involved in, and people from Europe, Brazil, and so on. They were all working very harmoniously, and they were very excited about the work they were doing with ITC, and they were getting fabulous, consistent results. And then at one point, some discord developed within the group. And in their words, the contact field collapsed. And it, at that point, became much more difficult for everyone to get results. They were still getting results, but it was not on the same level, with the same ease, and so on, that had been in the case.
Which is kind of the evidence that it is more about us than it is the systems that are used for the communication to occur. And that's generally true, I find, with lots of different things. If you're sitting in a circle, as long as everybody's harmonious, you can develop amazing things. If you're sitting in a circle and suddenly people aren't getting along, it kind of does put a spanner in the works, so to speak.
Exactly. We're part of the technology, as it were. And
Right.
Technology, can become a distraction. It can kind of run away with the whole process. I drive a 2006 Toyota Corolla sedan. It gets me where I want to go. It has no electronic keys except to open the door. It's got a nice big trunk. Every device on the dashboard is right there. It's got tactile controls. I don't have to punch up a touch screen and then see which controls are where. I can just do it sight unseen. To me, that era of automotive design was the pinnacle of achievement. I'm being a little bit silly, but there are things like collision avoidance and so on that we have now, which are good. I came across a quote about technology and civilization recently. I'll try to find it, but it was basically technology does not equal civilization, and that when we confuse the two, we're in trouble, as we have seen. And I think the AI revolution that's underway now, I think it's probably going to seek and find its own level at a certain point. It's obviously it's very useful and helpful in some ways, and in some ways it's over the top and dangerous. And apparently it costs so much to accomplish it that it's not going to be economically viable. That the more we extend it, we can double the capitalization, realize maybe 25% advantage, and the whole thing, some people think, it's going to fall apart economically. It's not going to pay its way. And so it may fall back to a point where it's got to actually be helpful and useful to us. And it's true of any of our creations. But in connection with afterlife communication, I think we're past the point where we need to advance the technology.
Dan, I have a car that has 17 computers in it. And I always think a good EMP blast will take all of that out. And your car will still be putting down the road at that
Well,
time.
it does have one computer in it. One, yeah. And hopefully it's well enough shielded. And that just, yeah, obviously brings up I'm glad you brought up the EMP question, because our whole civilization rides on multiple infrastructures like the one we're on now, and marvelously being able to communicate across space and see each other and practically be in each other's presence. You know, our civilization rides on fragile infrastructures. You know, you probably remember the Y2K scare,
Sure.
which it's silly that we hadn't anticipated it, but it happened. And it's now become a joke. But for those of us who were concerned about it, we understand that it took probably $1 trillion to remedy or work around in time. It was a real issue. And oh my goodness, we didn't think of that. And now we've got 3 months to fix it, right? The major corporations couldn't talk about it for legal reasons, but they were hard at work dealing with this. Now, a solar flare, which we already know, we're in a very high level of solar activity. It's part of the natural cycle, and we see the auroras, which are beautiful, and so on. But we also know that electromagnetic pulse or a coronal mass ejection can do serious damage to our electrical, never mind the internet, the power grid. This happened in Quebec, I think about 20 years ago, where they had to replace a whole bunch of their transformers, and transformers are not easily replaced. Normally, they don't keep enough spares to be able to just plug a new one in. So without our electric power, no food.
Yeah.
You know?
And getting back to simplicity, I remember the story of Bocce's radio, which was a simple old tube style radio. He got some of the most incredible communications from the other side. Now, I think Bocce was a medium in his own right, because I think they actually pulled tubes out of it and still the voices came through. So the simplicity of the device he was using did not affect the splendid communications that came through that radio.
And we don't know, where, at what point the voice enters the system. In Bocce's case, I could be wrong, but I believe I've heard that the voices actually were coming from just in front of the loudspeaker, not the loudspeaker itself. I could be wrong about that. But in any case, where the connection happens with the tape recorder or the radio or whatever you're using, there are all kinds of theories about that, and it may be different in different instances. You've seen in my film, you saw the phone call that Mark Macy received from Konstantin Raudova. Where did the connection? Did it happen in the telephone receiver, in the telephone itself? Did it happen in the lines? Who knows? But it was there, and it was recordable. It was an actual signal in the line.
And in those cases, incredibly clear. But for people who are not familiar with Konstantin Raudova, he was a EVP ITC researcher when he was living. And of course, he worked with old, reel tapes and that sort of thing. But apparently, he's still working on the same topic, which is amazing. But that said, talking about the technology and the changes, I've had EVP show up across Zoom platforms, and we know a lot of people are receiving messages over other technology like WhatsApp. There's a lot of good evidence and information around people who've regularly received communications through applications like that. So it looks like, and I'm going to use the word spirit just because it's a convenient term, but disembodied conscious awareness is able to continue to communicate whatever the technology is. But I would argue much as you have done already very well, Daniel, that they're communicating to us. The technology is just a platform, right? It is just, but the point is to interact with embodied souls, at least hopefully from their perspective. And that is the world changing event. That's the thing that makes the difference.
The collective intention does make a difference, and the collective awareness of what's possible makes a difference. I work, as you know, with a small group of mediums, which we call ourselves the Cosmic Voices team. And I've been working with them for 5-6 years now. And we've had some incredible experiences of tuning into folks. One of our two main mediums, Jean Love, lives in Los Angeles and grew up there. When she was a kid, a psychic told her, when you grow up, you're going to be a medium to the stars. And Jean says, yeah, but what they didn't tell me is they'd all be dead. And so what seems to be happening now is that when anyone in that community of artists and performers and so on passes over, they already know about Jean. And because she's an easy contact to make. And the joke from the other side is that so many people want to get through that they're having to give out numbered tickets on the other side. Last year, I think it was, we got a message from Liberace, who was a very well-known 20th century pianist. Was a very flamboyant character. He was very popular on early television and so on. And he came through and said, I finally got my ticket in. So and I think that's true, that those on the other side probably don't see us as separate as we see them from our side, that we are part of their larger picture, but we're just so dense that we don't get it. And so the obstacle seems to be more on our side, on our level of collective and individual consciousness. And we've been so acculturated to identify anything metaphysical with evil and spookiness. That's whoever thought that one up was a genius, because it worked. And we can picture the devil and so on. But it's time now where we need to do it or get off the pot, as they say, and really make a commitment to whatever our inclinations are. We may want to practice mediumship, we want to do ITC, we may just want to tune in to podcasts of people who are discussing these things and relating their experiences. However it's most natural and comfortable for us is what I think we should be doing. And I think the stresses and the tensions and the conflicts in our world are, it's unfortunate that it's taken this to bring us to this point. But in a way, we have no choice. And this is part of what I say in the introduction to my book, that I wrote this book, partly to help awaken people's interest in the greater reality. And also, and if that doesn't work, we're all going to the other side, which we are going anyway. And so we might as well have at least a glimpse of what to expect. And also how to interpret the bits and pieces that we're getting now in a way that's healthy and constructive and hopeful and positive.
Being a researcher, I find that in communications from the other side, those that have an inkling of what to expect, open themselves to the possibility, have a much easier time when they make that transition than those that have no concept or think there's nothing after the grave.
Yeah,
So,
it's if it's all for nothing, why bother?
right.
Just eat, drink, and be merry. Yeah. So some people speak of a sort of dividing of the way, where folks who are aware will go one way and folks who are unaware will go another. And if that's true, it's probably not for eternity anyway, because I don't think we're given any final choices. It's an ongoing process.
Yes, movement is never going to stop.
Right. And I think another thing we need to start getting comfortable with is the notion of eternity. eternity and infinity. Our minds naturally want to slice and dice reality into convenient bits and pieces. And that's fine as long as we don't take that to be the ultimate reality. Cosmology, again, astronomy, the cosmological end of astronomy is beginning to suspect and have the courage to say, well, maybe there is no beginning and end. You know, maybe what we're seeing now is just one cycle of many. And I mean, logically, I accept eternity because let's say there was a big bang. Well, whatever created that big bang must have already existed, and so on ad infinitum. And the fact that we can't normally conceive of eternity doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. You know, it's just that we can't conceive of it.
A finite mind has a really hard time wrapping itself around eternity, recognizing that as long as we're here, our minds are finite and linear. I can say for myself, and I think Sally would agree, you probably would agree, has changed my whole perspective on how I live life, how joyful my life is, even through adversity, because you realize all of this is just a passing show, and it's okay. I mean, you still deal with your problems and pay your bills, and all of that reality of the physical plane existence is there, but it's not a problem anymore.
I'm curious if you are working on anything new or what's occupying your time in these areas or in this field currently.
Well, thank you for asking. It's a really good question. And the answer is yes. I have a number of little unfinished projects that I'm working on completing. At this juncture, which is like next week, I'm turning 82. And so it's true. So I feel like I'm on my final sprint to the finish line. And so what's really important? I actually did a little hypnosis session. A very good friend of my housemate is a clinical hypnotherapist, and he does life between lives regressions, which I've experienced in the past, which were really incredible. But I did a session really out of curiosity, saying I want some guidance for the rest of my life. What's important? What's important now? What do I need to do first? And what came through most strongly and most importantly for me was something very simple. I have media production equipment that I've kept around for years that I have no further use for. I have plenty of other stuff that works. And the psychic energy that I have had to apply to keeping this stuff stored and organized and all that stuff was blinding me to other directions in my life. Just that's the simple fact of being a sort of a hoarder in that one area of my life, the physical stuff. It didn't in the hypnosis session, it didn't come to me in the form of information. It came to me, it uncovered the emotional energy that was tying me to this inanimate stuff. And that was a revelation. I can feel it. I can feel what's holding me down. So I did a clean out. I brought a car full of this media production equipment to a private school that I work with once a year. I do their graduation videos. It's fun, a little fun project, wonderful school. And they were delighted to receive all these goodies. And they said, oh, if you need any of them back, you can just borrow them back. So it wasn't
Access.
Right, I have access, but it's not Wayne. All right.
Right.
So, and I know, and I feel it directly that I need to do another level of clean out of my environment. So I'm doing things step by step. I just updated a little computer animated film that I originally did, I think 2010 or so, on a website where you upload a script and they create the animated film for you. And in this animated video, it's about 5 minutes long, a rabid skeptic confronts a real scientist. The new version of it is called Hi, I'm a Skeptic. And it's on Vimeo, and I'll give you the link for that. It's a fun little 5-minute piece. It's bit.ly/HIMASKEPIT. I'm a Skeptic.
You also mentioned Cosmic Voices Network. Tell people how they can access those communications online.
Okay. You can go to our website, which is cosmicvoices.network. It's one word, cosmicvoices.network. It's not .net, it's .network. There's also another abbreviated link, bit.ly/COVOICE, covoice. And that's how to get there. And you'll see the main page is called Messages. You'll see that in the menu. And that page has 2 columns in it. One is communications from people whose names you might very well know, some historical figures, number of artists and performers and so on. And there's another column of names of people who you might not recognize. I think they're both equally intriguing and important. One of them was the New York City fire captain at 9/11.
Right.
He and his men were killed at the same moment. And he checked in twice. And the 2 communications are really interesting, because one was about his initial experience, and the second one was after some period of time. And I won't say anything more about that, but suggest his name was I'm trying to think of his first name, but Callahan was his name, and he's in that right-hand column of the Messages page on cosmicvoices.network.
And I wanted to, for the viewers, as a reminder, tell them that we actually have done a couple of interviews with Gene Love and Regina Ochoa, and they both brought through in a 2-part series, which is in our lineup of videos. So you can go and hear many of the people you mentioned, many of the stars that came through, Olivia Newton-John, Robin Williams, many others. You can feel the energy of those people when they're bringing them through. And those are worthwhile videos to see.
Yeah, we've also had some communications with Konstantin Raudova. I don't think any of these are on the site, but getting back briefly to the question of ITC versus mediumship. Oh, and also another interesting thing about him, in all of the communications that we have recorded of his voice coming from the other side, he has a very consistent personality. It's kind of a little on the rough side, a little aggressive, really strong and gruff. I found the one recording of him during his lifetime, and it's completely different. Are you familiar with the Enneagram?
Yes.
Okay, well, his ITC voice is more like that of type 8, right?
Right. It is. I agree.
The recording, right? The recording I have of him, he sounds like a type 5, which is more of the left brain intellectual type, quieter,
yes,
more precise, and
yes.
so on. So my theory has been that his success as a communicator from the other side is partly based on his having adopted this more aggressive and firm personality. That, like a type 8, classic type 8, punching through whatever the resistance is. And as we've seen, he is capable of some of the longest consistent ITC communications going on for several minutes, which is rare, extremely
With
rare.
class A clarity too.
Yes,
I mean,
absolutely.
super clear.
Yeah, exactly so. And so in one of the communications we had with him, I asked him about this, and he said, yes, this was true. But that was it's like a commitment on his part to continue his work. And he also at the time, this was several years ago, felt that that ITC was important as a teaching device, but that in practical terms, we should be developing our psychic abilities. He said there will be a time when your communications may break down, your electronic communications may break down, as we've discussed, and that at that point we will have our natures to fall back on, as it were. And I think that's good advice.
I do too.
You know, and I haven't given that particular priority, but it's in the back of my head as something. Yeah, well, who knows?
I have a great fondness for Mr. Raudova, so thank you for
As-
sharing that.
As do I. As do I. And he made those phone calls to more than just Mark Macy. I know Sonia Rinaldi received a couple of them. The first one, she did not record it because it was out of the blue.
Mm.
And she didn't talk about it for many, many years because she thought it could be a hoax. And then the next time it happened, I believe she did record it, and now she will talk about them. But yeah, and I know others received phone calls from him, and those stopped. The phone calls did stop at some point. But you have to understand from the period of time, our environment has changed so much. I mean, we've got all these crazy microwaves and cell phone towers and things that were non-existent at the time those were happening. So there's a lot of, basically put it, garbage in our atmosphere, which changes their ability because it's all about the frequency.
This is something that I wonder about, and I'm not sure, because I'm not sure electromagnetic energy is necessarily involved, except at the very end of the chain, on our end, on the technology end.
Mm-hmm.
From my perspective, I could be wrong, but from my perspective, consciousness and the psyche operate at such an incredibly higher frequency that the two are not necessarily going to interfere with each other. So again, from my point of view, it's the human element, and in the case of ITC, the collective element of cooperation and so on, that would make more of a difference than anything else. Now, I'm not saying that the electromagnetic atmosphere is not involved, but I just question whether the energies are similar enough that they would interact and interfere with each other. Again, I don't know. When you talk about the psyche, whether frequency is literal or figurative, it may be something else. Some years ago, I did an essay called Zen and the Art of Debunkery. It was a how-to guide for the pathological skeptic. And I wrote this back around 1990 originally, and I presented it at a new science conference then. It was well received, and I had it on my website for ages. And it's also it's been on a website called skepticalaboutskeptics.org. This website was created by Rupert Sheldrake and some of his colleagues, and it's full of really excellent articles and critiques of what I call pathological skepticism or pseudo-skepticism. So it's been up there for a long time, and I recently decided that I wanted to make a self-published book out of it. So I'm learning the ropes of Amazon self-publishing and that sort of thing. And hopefully in the next couple of months, I'll be able to get it out there. But it's been fun. And I've also had a chance to refine and expand the essay itself and make it even sillier than the original. Because it really puts the screws to the illusion of skepticism that these folks try to pull off and pull over our eyes. What else? Oh, one of the first things I started to film before Tim Coleman and I got together was Mark Macy working with a device called the Luminator. Have you guys ever heard of the Luminator?
Saw your program for
that's
the
right.
global
Yes,
gathering.
Right. Yes, I presented a little rough cut there. The Luminator is a device that you plug it in the wall, you switch it on, let it run for a few minutes, and then you take Polaroid photographs of people in the room. And if you use Polaroid 600 film, which is still manufactured, many of the photographs will include anomalies that cannot be accounted for, even by photographic trickery. You couldn't do most of these things in Photoshop. Some of them involve second faces in the photos, distortions, transparency of the person, and see partly through them. Other anomalies which you can't get by opening the shutter and streaking things and doing time exposures and that sort of thing, would be they're so subtle, it'd be extremely difficult to do in Photoshop or for AI to produce or anything like that. These are genuine anomalies. And no one knows why this works, except this device, Illuminator, had been created by a man named Patrick Richards, whose specialties were heating, ventilating, air conditioning, acupuncture, homeopathy, and craniosacral therapy. So he put these two disciplines together and created this device, which is just like, it looks like a tall loudspeaker with grills on the top and bottom. It's got fans in it, air circulates from the bottom and out the top. So what's between the two fans? There's a plastic tube with other little tubes wrapped around it, filled with homeopathically charged liquids. And these are not like diluted chemicals. These apparently were psychically charged by Richards himself. He produced this as a diagnostic tool in his practice as a therapist. He would find that, and I don't know how he received the information about how to create this. He's now on the other side and we haven't contacted him, but somehow he got instructions as to how to do this. And what he would do is he would photograph his clients. And if the photograph came out with these paranormal distortions in it, he would know that they were out of balance. And if the therapy was successful, the photograph would come out clear, undistorted. So that was his original purpose. Then Mark Macy found out about him, and Patrick made one of these luminators for Mark that was supposedly fine-tuned to produce more of the anomalies. Maybe it was responding to the little imbalances we all have. But it worked. And he produced hundreds of these anomalous photographs. And when I met him, he was touring around. He went to New York City and San Francisco, did some public sessions there with people in the audience, as it were, who would come up and be photographed. And so I filmed several of these sessions and some talks that he gave and so on at the time. And what I showed on Wendy Zamet's podcast was a rough cut of this. And I'd like to go back and really do a nicer job with it and have a better narration and so on. But that's one of my projects. And again, it's one of these undeniable anomalies that involve a certain amount of technology, but can't really be explained in conventional terms. I mean, ITC is a wonderful proof of concept for people who are unfamiliar with afterlife communication. I think it points to something greater. I think mediumship is, as we think of it now, is on the right path. But just our normally being in the world is a form of mediumship. We're channeling ourselves, for starters. There are exercises I think we can do, apart from traditional spiritual exercises. When I'm out on my walk, sometimes I will try to imagine that I'm walking hand in hand with my late partner, Jane, who died in 2007. And I'll move over on the path to give her space to walk and just kind of like mock up the situation, but then see what kind of subtle input I get. Now, that happened one time when I least expected it. There are two sections of this path that I walk on. They're separated by some blocks. They have different characteristics, and they have different aquatic birds associated with them, to different populations of birds. So one day I'm walking on the path that I use now daily, and suddenly I feel Jane walking next to me, hand in hand. I didn't even try to do this. It was just boom, boom. Okay. And at one point, she turns around and goes the other way. So I turn around and I go the other way. And I soon see on the shore a night heron. Now, the night heron is a bird that does not come to that side of the creek. It comes to the side of the creek that Jane and I used to walk on when she was alive. It was her favorite bird. I'd never, ever seen one of those birds on this side of the creek until Jane turned me around to it. So, it's one little data point, but subjectively, I'm having fun with this process of visualization and tactilization, you might say. And hey, if it works at all, let's try it.
And it's those shared data points that changes the world, right? If we only ever keep it to ourselves and we don't share these experiences, then we just stay enclosed within our own psychosocial world, right? And that's where other people learn, is from, we're, as human beings, we're storytellers, and we learn through these experiences from other people as much as the ones that we have for ourselves. So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you, Daniel, for being with us today on Soul Explorers.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Always a pleasure to you guys.
We really
Take
enjoyed
care,
it.
and
Thanks.
we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
If you enjoyed this content, please hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell for notifications.